Think Chuck Norris only breaks bones? Think again. Today he walks into court. No law degree, no army, no fancy lawyers, just one unbreakable promise, and shatters a billion-dollar power machine. This isn't a movie, this is real, and it will make you believe that one person can still change the world. If this story moved you, hit subscribe now to never miss another moment of justice, courage, and those who refuse to back down. Share this video, because somewhere out there, someone still needs to know. We are never alone in the fight for what's right. The weather in Texas that day was far from pleasant. Thick clouds gathered, the sky was a dull grey, and the wind blew with an unusual chill for springtime. It was the kind of day that made anyone want to stay home, curled up in an old armchair, sipping hot coffee, listening to the crackling radio play familiar country tunes. But in downtown Dallas, outside the federal courthouse, a crowd had gathered since early morning. People weren't there just to watch an ordinary lawsuit. They had come to witness Chuck Norris, martial arts legend, veteran, once a hero on the silver screen, face off against one of America's largest pharmaceutical corporations, Pharma. Outside on the courthouse steps, wheelchairs, wooden crutches, and worn military uniforms mingled in the crowd. Veterans from across the country had gathered. They stood silently, no banners, no chants, just watching, waiting. For them, this wasn't just a lawsuit, this was a battle to reclaim hope. Inside the courthouse, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. Reporters packed the room. Tiny recorders littered the tables. Pale fluorescent lights cast a cold glow on the walls, highlighting every furrowed brow, every cold stare. Chuck Norris sat at the plaintiff's table. 84 years old, silver-haired, dressed in a simple grey-dew suit. He barely moved, quietly observing. Beside him, his lawyer, a young woman named Rebecca Harlow, flipped through files, whispering with her team of aides. Chuck said nothing, his calloused hand resting on the cold wooden table, eyes fixed straight ahead. Across from him at the defense table sat Claudia Kingsley, perfectly upright, exuding pride. Claudia was known as one of the sharpest corporate attorneys in the U.S. Icy blue eyes, neatly tied blonde hair, a sleek black dress. Every detail about her broadcasted one message: I don't lose. Next to Claudia, Pharma's legal team, all Ivy League faces, buried themselves in laptops and phones, exchanging glances. Above them, Judge Malcolm Reynolds entered, tall, stern-faced. He was used to high-stakes cases, but today something made him hesitate to get a beat as he sat down. Maybe it was Chuck's gaze. Not angry, but carrying a strange, quiet calm. A calm that no one dared dismiss. The gavel struck. Court is now in session. Rebecca rose, her voice soft but firm. Your Honor, we represent a group of veterans who participated in clinical trials for the drug PDX-47, developed by Pharma. This drug saved their lives, but the company abruptly halted production, citing unfeasible costs, despite knowing that stopping the supply would push dozens of patients toward death. Claudia smirked slightly. Your Honor, Pharma has no legal obligation to continue producing an unapproved drug. This is a matter of process, not emotion. Malcolm nodded, motioning to proceed. Rebecca turned toward Chuck. Mr. Norris, can you tell the court why you're standing up in this case? Chuck slowly stood, his back straight, his eyes bright. He didn't need a microphone, his voice carried clearly. I'm not here for myself. I'm here for the comrades who fell, for those still alive but being forgotten by the system every day. I'm not a lawyer, I'm not a scientist, but I know this. When a company holds the key to saving lives but locks it away just because it doesn't turn a profit, that's no longer a commercial issue. That's a moral one. In the gallery behind him, whispers rippled. Claudia glanced at her team, signaling them to stay quiet. Malcolm looked down. Thank you, Mr. Norris. We'll stick to the evidence, not speeches. Ms. Harlow, please continue. Rebecca nodded, displaying a video. A veteran, sunken eyes, trembling voice. EDX-47 saved me. I was ready to die, but now they tell me there's no more medicine. I don't understand why. Claudia immediately stood. Look, the play objection. This clip has no legal standing. Malcolm nodded. Objection sustained. Ms. Kingsley, you may respond. Claudia stepped forward, her voice sharp as a blade. EDX-47 has not been FDA approved. It was merely an experimental study. We complied with all regulations. We have no obligation to manufacture an incomplete product, and there is no evidence that we violated any patient protection statutes. Rebecca smirked faintly. What about the conditional agreement? The one stating that if the drug showed efficacy, the company would prioritize continued supply for trial patients during the transition period. She held up a stack of papers. Claudia crossed her arms. This contract holds no legal weight because Phase 3 trials were incomplete. Everything was fully discussed and signed with patient consent. She glanced at Chuck. If Mr. Norris wants to debate ethics, perhaps he should write a book, not come to court. The courtroom fell silent. Chuck didn't react. He merely gazed at Claudia, then turned to the back rows, where veterans sat quietly, some with clouded eyes, others with visible scars across their faces. Malcolm cleared his throat. We'll recess for 15 minutes. Plaintiff, prepare your next witness. Chuck stepped into the hallway, standing by the large window, staring out at the gloomy sky. Rebecca approached softly. Chuck, I'm not sure we can win this. They're too strong. They have a dozen lawyers, mountains of paperwork. Chuck smiled faintly. Rebecca, do you know why I'm here? She waited, silently. He gazed into the distance, eyes narrowing slightly. Because I've stood on battlefields. I've seen people who had nothing left still stand up to protect each other. I'm not here to win. I'm here to tell those veterans out there, they're not abandoned. Rebecca took a deep breath and nodded. When the court session resumed, Rebecca stepped up to the stand, introducing the next witness, a lab engineer named Anthony Ward, who had worked at Pharma. Anthony bowed his head, his voice shaky. I worked on the PDX-47 project. I know for a fact there's a backup batch in the cold storage, enough for at least 50 patients. But the board decided to hold it back, not distribute it, waiting until they got approval so they could sell it at a higher price. Claudia raised her eyebrows, instantly springing up. Objection! This is baseless testimony, no supporting evidence. Anthony lowered his head even further, fumbling. I don't have documents, just my word. Malcolm raised his hand. He acknowledged the testimony, but we require additional evidence. Anthony stepped down from the stand, his face pale. Chuck watched him, his eyes darkening. Rebecca clenched her fists. Claudia sat back down, smirking with satisfaction. Lawyer, court is adjourned for today. We will continue tomorrow. Later that afternoon, Chuck sat alone in the break room. Outside the window, the sun set slowly, casting a soft orange glow across the sky. Rebecca entered, silent for a moment, then spoke. Chuck, I know you're not a lawyer, but are you planning anything? Chuck looked outside. I made a phone call. We'll get an answer by tomorrow morning. Rebecca furrowed her brow. Who did you call? Chuck didn't answer. He simply kept looking at the sunset, eyes gleaming with something, not anger, not despair, but the quiet patience of someone who had waited through many battles, many losses, to reach this moment. In the distance, the sound of car horns echoed. Darkness slowly descended over Dallas, and inside the courthouse, an untold story was about to unfold. The next morning, a light rain fell outside the Dallas Federal Courthouse. The raindrops fell steadily, like the slow ticking of time, amplifying the weight of the tension waiting inside. Courtroom 3A had been packed since 8 a.m. People weren't just here to follow a legal proceeding, they had come to witness something extraordinary. They wanted to know, could Chuck Norris, the man once seen kicking down doors in action movies, use his words to open the door to real justice? No one believed it. No one was betting on him. Chuck sat quietly in the front row. None of the slick-dressed lawyers on the other side knew that last night he hadn't slept a wink. Not out of fear, but because he couldn't rest while those veterans, his old battle brothers, his comrades, were slowly losing their last hope of survival. "My child survives because of that drug," a young mother choked out in the hallway. "Now they say they're stopping production. Say it's not economically viable." "Economically? It's given my child 2 more years. That's enough for me." Chuck had heard those words, had shaken their hands and had hugged them, and now he carried all that pain into the courtroom, like a quiet flame burning inside. The courtroom doors swung open. The sharp click of high heels echoed on the marble floor. Claudia Kingsley walked in, face cold, makeup sharp as a chiseled ice sculpture, the most famous attorney in the South, who had won 27 major cases for pharmaceutical giants. She was known as the Queen of Prescription Denial. She didn't look at Chuck. She merely nodded slightly to the court clerk, placed her leather case on the defense table, and sat down, as if she already knew today's outcome. Chief Judge Monroe opened the session with a measured, formal tone. Everyone listened as the plaintiff's side, represented by the volunteer attorney working with Chuck, laid out the case. With heartfelt sincerity, he recounted how the group of veterans had been treated with the experimental drug FZ-101 by Pharma, how 64% had shown positive results, and how the company had abruptly halted supply despite knowing patients were dependent on survival. Claudia stood up. "Your Honor," she began, "we are discussing a product that has not been FDA approved, has not completed Phase 3 trials, and has no scientific basis for concluding sustainable efficacy. Pharma has no legal obligation to manufacture or distribute FZ-101, and there is no statute that requires them to continue a money-losing experimental program." Every word she spoke was razor-sharp, cold as steel. Chuck clenched his fists. "Sit down, Mr. Norris. It's not your turn," the young attorney whispered. Chuck stared straight at the judge's bench. "Let me say one thing," he spoke, his voice low and firm. "Not about law, about people." The entire courtroom turned to look. Judge Monroe tilted his head. "Briefly," he allowed, "Your Honor, I don't have a law degree. I'm not good at arguing, but I know what it feels like to look at someone who's about to die and not be able to do anything. I was a medic. I once cradled a friend's head as he passed away on the battlefield. FZ-101 isn't a miracle, but it gave many veterans, men who had nothing left, a shred of hope. Now, Pharma says they have no obligation to keep making it. Your Honor, I ask you, if not for the law, then what do we live for?" A minute of silence. Then the tap-tap of Claudia's pen. "Touching," she said without looking up. "But this is a courtroom, not a theater." Chuck sat down. His face didn't waver, but his eyes ran deep. "Report?" The trial moved into the evidence phase. Chuck's side had only one document, a summary of clinical results compiled by volunteer medical teams, unverified by the FDA. Not enough legal weight. Chuck looked back at the rows of veterans. One man breathed gently through an oxygen tube. Another leaned, eyes closed, on his wife's shoulder. They had all come with a single hope, that Chuck could do what they could not. But today, that hope was thinning, like the last breath on a cold winter afternoon. The decisive blow from Pharma. Suddenly, Claudia requested to make an additional statement. "We submit a financial report. FZ-101 has caused a $28 million, 0 cents loss just in the second quarter of this year. We also provide documentation confirming all research was terminated as of July. There are no remaining products in inventory." A crushing blow. The courtier nodded, accepting the documents. Chuck said nothing. But he knew something didn't add up. A suspicious glance and a fragile ray of hope. As the court broke for lunch, a courthouse maintenance worker quietly approached Chuck. Dressed in a grey uniform, his face weathered. "Mr. Norris," he said softly, "I overheard Pharma say there's no stock left, but last week I was hired to clean one of their cold storage facilities. I don't know much, but I saw crates labeled FZ101, sealed and seemingly intact. Chuck looked up. Coordinates. The man slipped a small piece of paper into Chuck's hand. Don't tell anyone I gave you this. Chuck looked at the slip, then folded it carefully, tucking it into the breast pocket over his heart. At that moment, his eyes no longer looked like those of an old man, but like the eyes of a warrior who had spotted a crack in the enemy's fortress. The trial was still underway, but the battle had just gained a flicker of hope. In the hazy cold of the afternoon, the courtroom echoed with the heavy sounds of shoes on tile, the rustling of papers, and murmured debates of journalists and spectators. Outside, the grey sky seemed to press another layer of gloom onto Chuck Norris's slender but still sturdy shoulders. He was no longer the action hero, no longer the undefeated fighter. He was just an old man, sitting there, eyes fixed ahead, quiet as a lone mountain. But inside him, with every heartbeat, every breath, every thought, the fires roared. All morning, Chuck had been battered by sharp legal arguments, dry contractual clauses, and cold financial charts from Pharmadine's side. Claudia Kingsley, the company's lead attorney, radiated confidence and was almost arrogant. She smiled as she wrapped up the morning with the financial report proving FZ101 had been completely dropped from the company's product line. No inventory, no obligation, no chance. And the court, with cool neutrality, merely nodded in acceptance. But only Chuck knew that the tiny piece of paper in his breast pocket was burning hot. That paper held the address of the cold storage facility where an anonymous worker had seen the FZ101 stockpile. That information wasn't in any official record, didn't appear in any report, and wasn't mentioned in the morning's debate. It was a secret that could turn everything around. Chuck left the courtroom during the lunch break. He didn't eat, didn't speak to anyone. He stood under the courthouse awning, eyes gazing far down the street, where the Pharmadine warehouse loomed behind security fences. He took a long breath, feeling the damp chill seep through his thick coat. In that moment, memories from long ago flooded back. 1971, Saigon, a torrential night. Chuck, then a military advisor, was caught in an ambush. He and his unit had to retreat into an abandoned supply depot, holding out all night. That was when he learned a hard lesson. When the enemy pulls back too easily, it means there's another hand reaching from behind, and that hand usually strikes hardest just when you exhale in relief. Chuck re-entered the courtroom when the lunch break ended. Claudia was already standing, preparing her defense papers. Her face looked pale, but she maintained professional composure. On the large screen, Lionel Thorne, the Pharmadine's CA, no longer appeared. It was now just a game of paperwork. But as Judge Monroe struck his gavel to resume proceedings, the courtroom door suddenly burst open. A young deliveryman, panting, ran in, clutching a large envelope. He raised it high. For Mr. Chuck Norris. All eyes turned to Chuck. He walked over, quietly took the envelope, and opened it. Inside were several photographs, some printed documents, and a handwritten note. Midian, let's hide the drugs. They smuggled them out and sold them illegally to private labs for unauthorized testing. Addresses and transaction receipts included. Chuck's heart pounded. This wasn't just a case of hiding stock. This was a smuggling ring. Illegal sales of experimental drugs, violating federal law, placing thousands of patients' lives in the hands of unlicensed private entities. He handed the documents to James, his young lawyer, whispering, "Submit this to the court. I have something to do." James's mouth fell open. "Where are you going?" Chuck only nodded, his eyes resolute. To find the true source of all this, he turned, leaving behind a courtroom now buzzing with rising tension over the new revelations. James hurried forward, submitting the documents to Judge Monroe, while on the other side, Claudia Kingsley had gone pale, leaning over to whisper urgently to her assistant. Outside the courthouse, Chuck hailed a taxi to Riverdale Industrial Park. "Warehouse 14, he said firmly. The driver glanced at him in the rearview mirror, hesitated slightly upon recognizing the familiar face, but then gave a small nod and pressed the gas. During the ride, Chuck closed his eyes, breathing deeply. He knew this could be a trap, but he also knew if no one dared face the truth, those veterans, the ones sitting back in the courtroom, would never get justice. The taxi pulled up in front of an old warehouse. Its metal shutters closed and no signage was visible. Chuck stepped out, his figure slightly hunched, walking slowly but steadily. He knocked on the door 3 times. No answer. He knocked again, harder. The door swung open. A tall man in a black suit stepped out. "You're Chuck Norris?" the man rumbled. "Yeah, come in. My boss is waiting." Inside, the warehouse was dimly lit, with just a few yellow bulbs dangling from the ceiling. A long table, a few chairs. At the head of the table sat a familiar face. Lionel Thorne, but Nearath wasn't alone. Standing behind him were 2 other men, unfamiliar, with the bearing of politicians. Lionel smiled, not the confident smile from the courtroom screen, but a smug, dangerous grin. "Mr. Norris, I must admit, you're better than I thought. But do you really think you can topple an entire system with just a few photos and an accusation?" Chuck crossed his arms, standing tall. "I don't need to topple the system, I just need to expose the truth." One of the unfamiliar men spoke, his voice gentle but cold. "Mr. Norris, there are things you don't understand. Pharma isn't just a company. It's part of a national medical research chain, serving defense and developing strategic pharmaceuticals. What you're digging into isn't just business contracts, it's classified projects. If you keep pushing, you won't just be facing lawyers." Chuck looked him straight in the eye, unblinking. "You've stood in front of loaded guns more times than you can count, and I'm still standing. You think a threat will make me back down?" Lionel tapped his fingers lightly on the table. "You can walk away now, Mr. Norris. We're prepared to fund lifetime care for you and your veteran group. In exchange, you drop the lawsuit and destroy all documents." Chuck closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, eyes shining fiercely. When have you ever seen a fear which moved alone? Lionel raised an eyebrow. "I promised that if I made it home alive, I'd never abandon my brothers. And I've kept that promise." At that moment, a noise echoed outside the door. Federal agents stormed in, guns raised, shouting, "Everyone down! Do not move!" Chuck stood still, unsurprised. He had secretly activated his phone's GPS tracker and sent it to James before entering the warehouse. He knew the young lawyer would figure it out. Lionel and the 2 shadowy men were handcuffed and led out. Chuck slowly walked to the door, breathing in the cold evening air. He knew the legal battle wasn't over, but he also knew he had just cracked open a level of power no one dared touch. And he did it not for fame, not for money, but for one reason: to keep a promise. When Chuck returned to the courtroom the next morning, everyone stood up. But this time, it wasn't out of mockery or curiosity, it was out of respect. He walked to the plaintiff's table and sat down quietly. James placed a hand on his shoulder, smiling gently. "You did it." Chuck nodded slightly. He didn't need to say anything. Situation sponsor agility. In his heart, he carried the faces of his comrades. Those who had fallen, those who still lived, those waiting for justice. And he knew he hadn't let them down. That morning, Dallas bathed in a pale, honey-colored sunlight, streaming through the federal courthouse windows, illuminating the crowded rows of veterans in wheelchairs, anxious families, and reporters crammed into every corner. Everyone was present, not just to hear a verdict, but to witness whether an old man, without a law degree, without power, armed only with calloused hands and unwavering eyes, could bring down a corporate giant. Chuck Norris entered the courtroom with a steady gait. No one clapped. No one cheered. They simply rose to their feet, nodding slightly, like soldiers watching their commander return from a life-or-death battle. Chuck returned the nod softly. His eyes scanned the room, pausing briefly on a young soldier missing both legs, tightly gripping his wife's hand. a tightness caught in Chuck's throat. At the judge's bench, Judge Monroe was ready. James Harrington, the young lawyer who had stood by Chuck since day one, laid out the case files, his face tense but his eyes bright with determination. Across the room, Claudia Kingsley still sat, but her composure was gone. She looked uneasy, anxious, glancing occasionally at the courtroom door as if hoping someone would arrive to save her. The doors swung open. Lionel Thorne, Pharma Dean's CEO, was led in by federal agents, handcuffed, his face tight with rage. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom. Everyone understood this was no longer just a civil lawsuit. This had become a showdown between justice and ambition, between one man and an entire system. Judge Monroe struck the gavel, his voice slow and weighty, each word sinking deep into the room. The court will now proceed with the presentation of new evidence. Plaintiff, you may begin. James stood, taking a deep breath. Your Honor, he began, we have submitted documentation proving that Pharma not only concealed the experimental drug FC101, but also secretly funneled it to private laboratories, violating federal law. These actions constitute not only commercial fraud, but also direct endangerment of patient lives and the integrity of the national health system. He held up a thick stack of papers, his voice growing firmer. We have delivery receipts, shipping records, storage facility addresses, and witness testimony. Most importantly, we have evidence that Pharma executive board, including Mr. Lionel Thorne, directly orchestrated these activities while deceiving both the court and federal authorities throughout these proceedings. The room's atmosphere thickened. Claudia Kingsley bowed her head, her hands trembling slightly. Lionel Thorne glared but remained silent. The cuffs on his wrists pressed coldly against his skin, a stark symbol that power no longer sat with him. Judge Monroe leafed through the documents, his expression growing heavier with each page. Finally, he looked up, his gaze sharp. Defense, do you have a response? Claudia slowly stood, her voice hoarse. Your Honor, I request to withdraw as counsel. Additionally, I inform the court that Blackwell and Partners will fully cooperate with the federal investigation. A ripple of murmurs swept through the room. Chuck closed his eyes, breathing out slowly. He felt as if a 1,000-pound stone had lifted from his chest. But he knew the most critical part still lay ahead. Judge Monroe raised the gavel. Evidence presented. This court finds that Pharma has engaged in severe legal violations and deliberate deception. Therefore, the court orders an immediate suspension of all Pharma activities related to FZ101, the transfer of the existing FZ101 stockpile to the Department of Health for emergency patient distribution, a full criminal investigation into Pharma executive leadership, compensation for damages to the affected patients as determined by court assessment. The final strike of the gavel fell, heavy and echoing. In that moment, no one laughed, no one cheered. Only the sound of shaky breaths, the soft fall of tears. A young veteran gripped Chuck's hand tightly, whispering, "You did it. You kept your promise." Chuck squeezed the young man's hand, his own eyes glistening. "Not me," he whispered softly. "All of us." Ban Tartar Smith. Outside the courthouse, the crowd erupted in cheers, camera flashes sparking relentlessly. But Chuck didn't step up to any podium. He quietly made his way through the crowd toward a small truck parked at the corner. On the truck bed, crates of FZ101 were being unloaded and handed over to medical teams. Chuck placed a hand on one crate, closed his eyes, whispering a silent prayer for those who were gone and for those still holding on. James Harrington rushed up, beaming. "You are turning down interviews from CNN and Fox News?" Chuck gave a faint, tired smile. "I don't need to be on TV anymore, James. I just need to know the medicine is getting to the people who need it." James slowed. his voice softening. Do you realize you've just set an unprecedented legal precedent? Congress will have to review the entire pharmaceutical oversight system. Law schools will be teaching this case for years. Chuck looked at him, his eyes wise and steady. Laws don't get stronger because of lawsuits. They get stronger when the people inside them learn how to make things right. A quiet spring evening drifted over Lone Wolf Ranch, where Chuck returned after the trial. Out on the wide lawn, veterans gathered around a campfire, chatting, laughing, occasionally humming old songs. Chuck sat silently on a wooden chair, gazing into the distance. A young soldier approached, handing him a hot cup of coffee. "Not joining us by the fire, Mr. Norris?" Chuck accepted the cup, smiling faintly. "I prefer sitting out here, just listening to you all laugh." The young man sat down beside him. "I used to think there was no hope left, but now I know what hope looks like." Chuck placed a weathered hand on the young man's shoulder, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Hope isn't about waiting for miracles. Hope is when we stand up, even if we're the last one standing, and say, 'No, not this time.'" They sat quietly together. The night breeze swept across, carrying the scent of grass, earth, and the freedom that so many had bled to preserve. Chuck closed his eyes, feeling each breath of the night. He knew this battle was over, but there were still many more to come. And he was ready. Not with punches, not with fame, but with a heart that had never learned to surrender. Spring winds blew gently across the open fields behind Lone Wolf Ranch, carrying the scent of fresh grass, new wood, and the aroma of coffee rising from small cups passed between veterans. The sun had just set, leaving a pale strip of orange at the horizon, painting the sky in a soft bluish pearl haze. On the lawn, a group of children of veterans' families ran and played, their laughter filling the peaceful evening like a song of rebirth. Chuck Norris stood quietly at the edge of the yard, hands in his jacket pockets, eyes gazing into the distance. No one disturbed him. Everyone knew, even when he stood alone, he was connected to all of them, listening, present. In Chuck's heart, the long journey replayed like a slow-motion film. The early days at court, mocked by skeptics. The sleepless nights, poring over files. The moment he realized an invisible hand was pulling the strings. The face-to-face showdown with Lionel Thorne in the dim warehouse. Finally, Judge Munro nodded as he delivered the historic ruling. An old veteran, hair silver, walking with a limp, approached. "Jub," the man said softly, "they want you by the fire. Everyone's waiting." Chuck turned back, offering a warm, quiet smile. "I'll come in. I just want to stand here a little longer. To remember." The older man didn't press, just nodded, gave a firm pat on Chuck's shoulder, and walked away. Chuck looked up at the sky where the stars had just begun to appear. He thought of those who were no longer here, those who had fought beside him. He remembered the whispers in the dark of the battlefield. "If we make it home, we'll keep our promise to each other." And today, he had kept that promise. Not just for himself, but for those who could no longer speak for themselves. The next morning, Lone Wolf Ranch awoke to a new rhythm. Reporters gathered, not to cover the trial's aftermath, but to report on something even bigger. The official founding of the Veterans' Rights Defense Fund. Chuck Norris and the team of young lawyers he had worked with announced the creation of the fund, joined by activists, doctors, legal experts, and veterans from across the United States. Chuck's statement was simple, without microphones or a raised podium. "We're not waiting for the next lawsuit," he said calmly. "We are moving ahead. We will protect land, protect rights, and protect the voices that are being drowned out. Because we've learned one thing. If we don't stand up, no one will stand up for us." Beside him stood James Harrington, youthful and determined, eyes shining with energy. Melissa Chun, the young lawyer who had once risked everything to blow the whistle on her own firm, was there too, her hair neatly tied back, her gentle but resolute smile speaking volumes. They were a team now, not one seeking fame, only seeking justice. Reporters asked Chuck about his next plans. He simply chuckled. I passed the age of planning a long time ago. Now, I just go where I'm needed most. In the following months, Congress passed the Veterans Asset Protection Act, an unprecedented piece of legislation mandating a comprehensive review of all projects that could threaten the property, rights, or living conditions of veterans. States began forming specialized legal task forces. The media called it the Norris effect. At Lone Wolf Ranch, expansion projects began. A new therapy center was under construction, and rehabilitation specialists, mental health experts, and doctors from across the country volunteered to work there. But Chuck was rarely seen at ribbon-cutting ceremonies or press conferences. Most of his time was spent walking round the ranch, talking to veterans and listening to each person's story. He understood that real power didn't come from money, it came from presence, from listening, from walking alongside those who had been forgotten. One evening, as Chuck sat alone on the porch steps, Jake, the young veteran who ran the ranch greenhouse, came to sit beside him. "Mr. Norris," Jake said softly, "I read the news. They say you should run for Senate." Chuck let out a low, gravelly laugh. "Do you know what scares me most, Jake? Not guns, not ambition, not even failure. It's the thought of sitting in a Senate chair all day listening to debates, unable to help anyone." Jake burst out laughing. "So, what do you want to do?" Chuck looked out over the vast fields, where moonlight danced on the grass. "I want you, and people like you, to live in peace. That's all." 6 months after the trial, a small private celebration was held at Lone Wolf Ranch. Days. No media, no politicians, just veterans, their families, and a few close friends. A new wooden sign had been installed, carved with the words, "Where promises are kept." Melissa Chun stepped up to a small wooden platform, her voice clear and steady. "We are here today not just to celebrate a legal victory. We are here to remind each other that every system, every law, every organization only has meaning when it serves people, protects people, and listens to people." She turned her gaze toward Chuck, her eyes shimmering. "This man taught me that courage isn't the absence of fear. Courage is knowing you're afraid and still stepping forward because someone needs you." Applause spread through the crowd, not loud, not flashy, but slow and firm, like the heartbeat of people who had weathered many scars, many losses, yet still believed. That night, after everyone had gone home, Chuck quietly walked along the wooden fence line, stopping at an old bench overlooking the grassy hills. He sat down, exhaled slowly, and closed his eyes. The breeze rustled softly, as if an invisible hand were gently brushing his shoulder. In the silence, he thought of those no longer here, those who had fought beside him, those who had laughed, battled, and hoped. And he whispered silently in his heart, "We kept the promise, brothers. No matter how long, no matter how hard, we didn't let it fade away." In that moment, it felt as if someone was sitting next to him, as if unseen hands rested lightly on his shoulders, as if old comrades were smiling at him from afar. Chuck opened his eyes, looked up at the starlit sky, and smiled quietly. "To bury this long, I finally understand. Not about the punches, not about the victories, not about the fame. The only thing that matters is keeping the promise." He rose, walking slowly back toward the warm glow of the main house. Inside, there were voices, laughter, and soft guitar music drifting through the air. Inside, there was the life he had spent his remaining years protecting. And he knew he wasn't done yet. Tomorrow, there would be new battles waiting. But tonight, he allowed himself to be still, to listen to the wind, the earth, and the quiet voice in his heart. Not this time. Never again. If this story moved you, hit subscribe now to never miss another moment of justice, courage, and those who refuse to back down. Share this video because somewhere out there, someone still needs to know we are never alone in the fight for what's right.